Prime Minister Narendra Modi held wide-ranging talks with his Japanese counterpart Fumio Kishida to expand India-Japan strategic partnership for a peaceful, stable and prosperous post-COVID world. The Japanese Prime Minister arrived in Delhi this morning for a almost 27-hour visit to ramp up bilateral ties in a range of areas and explore convergence between India's presidency of G20 and Japan's presidency of G7 to address various global problems. In fact, this evening, Prime Minister Modi and the Japanese Prime Minister went to the Buddha Jayanti Park. These are the pictures that you can see on your television screens, underlining the cultural ties between the two based on Buddhism as well. Earlier in the day, the two sides held bilateral talks in which several issues, most importantly with regards to resilient supply chain of semiconductors, was discussed. Apart from that, $75 billion pledged by the Japanese side for the Indo-Pacific, another important point that has been made here. The common threat of China is what is believed to be bringing the two sides closer together. We are seeing ramped up engagements between India and Japan. We have seen 3 visits or at least 3 meetings between both the prime ministers last year. This year too, it will be about 3 big the 3 meetings at big platforms that the 3 will have. This is the first visit of the Japanese Prime Minister to India this year. Prime Minister Modi will be travelling for the G7 summit as an invitee country to Japan, to Hiroshima, and then Prime Minister Fumio Kishida will be travelling to India yet again this year for the G20 summit. Japan wants to decrease its trade dependence on China. The two are partnering in the Quad. They conduct naval exercises together, the Malabar exercise being the most important here. Prime Minister Kishida will travel again for the G20 summit to India. So this partnership, the coming together of India and Japan, also the Japanese Prime Minister unveiling his future vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, are all issues of importance at the moment. Let me go across to our 2 guests who are joining us on the show. Dr. Satoru Nago, fellow non-resident Japan Hudson Institute based in Tokyo in areas in fact focusing on South Asia, East Asia and the Pacific. And we are also being joined by Dr. Mohan Kumar, Chairman RIS and former Indian Ambassador to France as well. Let me first go across to our guest who is joining us here from Tokyo, Dr. Nagao. First of all, how do you see the vision for the Indo-Pacific that has been unveiled by Prime Minister Fumio Kishida today? He drew parallels between what and how China behaves in the Indo-Pacific to Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Do you think this is some sort of a pushing of an idea that G7 is trying to repeatedly point out, whereas other countries, say for instance even India, might not view it in a similar manner? Is it?
Yes, thank you very much for asking. And it is honor for me to speak. My idea related to this. The Prime Minister Kishida come to India to publish the Indo-Pacific plan. So which is directly related to the G7 and the G20, because this is the idea India and Japan will lead. We can remember what happened, or what was the starting point of the concept Indo-Pacific. In 2007, 15 years ago, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe addressed in the Indian Parliament confluence of the 2 seas. That was the starting point of the Indo-Pacific. So this Indo-Pacific started from India. Now Prime Minister Kishida visit India and try to publish the Indo-Pacific plan, materialize the plan of the Indo-Pacific concept from India again. So this Indo-Pacific, India is the core, because we can compare the Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific. Asia-Pacific do not include India. So why we need Indo-Pacific? Because of India. So this is the day of India. That is a message from Japan, and that is a message Japan want to publish through the G7 and G20. So that's why this is very important day for Indo-Pacific.
All right. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, do you see that there are overlaps in G7 and G20, and therefore the point that I was making with regards to what the Japanese Prime Minister today said, the Russian aggression against Ukraine by Russia, also the fact that in Indo-Pacific we are looking at China as a country that has unleashed some sort of a territorial and maritime hegemony. Is that link constantly being drawn, and this overlap of G7 or the ideas being trying to fit into G20 might not work?
Thank you very much for having me on your show. I think India cannot have a successful G20 summit without co-opting the G7. There has to be a meeting ground between the G7 countries and the G13 countries, if you like. The G20 being 20 countries. So I think we need to keep that in mind. I want to make 3 points. One, it is not lost on anybody that Prime Minister Kishida is in Delhi when Xi Jinping is in Moscow meeting Putin at the same time. And mind you, all 4 countries in a way belong to Asia. Even Russia is considered a Eurasian power. So that's the first point I'd like to make. The second point is the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida's statement that India is an indispensable partner for Japan. I think that's critical, and that's because both Japan and India believe in a multipolar Asia. We don't want a hegemon in Asia. And you know which country I have in mind when I talk about a hegemon. I think the other point which Prime Minister Kishida is making, and they are trying to convince India that what happened in Ukraine can happen tomorrow in the Indo-Pacific. Then what? And that is why there is an emphasis by both countries on a rules-based Indo-Pacific. But having said all of this, I go back to the point that you made. I think there is still some gaps in the understanding of G7 versus G13 in the G20. I do not believe myself that those gaps are unbridgeable. But it's interesting that India is now so close to Japan in Asia. We think that the Japanese-Indian relationship can be the fulcrum on which Indo-Pacific, Quad, and other things can function in Asia. So I think it's a terribly important relationship, which was cultivated by Prime Minister Modi with Abe-san, and then Abe-san was unfortunately assassinated. But what gives me hope is the fact that these 2 leaders will meet at least 3 times. They're going to meet in Hiroshima, they're going to meet in Australia for the Quad Summit, and they will again meet in September for the G20 Summit. So there's going to be an unbelievable level of close talks between India and Japan to bridge those tiny gaps, as I call it, in order that we can have a successful September G20 Summit in Delhi.
Dr. Nagao, is this coming closer of India and Japan largely based on the common threat of China in the Indo-Pacific?
Yes, of course. Japan and India share the same problem, China's provocation. When we check the number of the incursion in the India-China border and China's incursion, the sea around the Senkaku Island in the East China Sea, indeed, both of 2 sides, China's activity has increased in 2012 and 2019 at the same time. So 2 countries share the same problem, China's provocation. It is obviously right. And so that's why India and Japan should cooperate. And if India and Japan cooperate, China need to divide their military expenditure 2 sides, against India, against Japan. So it is beneficial for India and Japan. We need to maintain military balance. In this case, budget is matter. But in this case, if we can divide their budget, 2 sides, it is beneficial. So with the other Quad member, we can divide more. That is also beneficial. That's why we should cooperate and beneficial for all of us.
Also, Dr. Mohan Kumar, as far as the stress on semiconductors is concerned, we've seen this being raised with the American side as well, the initiative that India and the US have undertaken not very long back, just a few weeks ago. And now the stress that was laid on it today during the conversation with the Japanese Prime Minister as well, highlighted by Prime Minister Modi today. How do you see that cooperation within the Indo-Pacific between like-minded countries?
Yes, and I also think the concept of resilient supply chain and resilient trade has taken hold. And frankly, if I were to be absolutely honest, what I mean by this, what everybody means by resilient supply chain, is essentially to reduce the dependence, the overwhelming dependence on China that India may have and Japan may have. So I cannot imagine India's trade, economic and investment strategy to diversify away from China. It cannot be successful without Japan's help. We need Japan and we need South Korea as well. And I would like to also make a point that I wholeheartedly welcome the détente between Japan and South Korea. That is good for Asia. And there has been a remarkable visit lately by the South Korean president. And I think the détente between Japan and South Korea will also help India. But going back to Japan, the kind of things that the Prime Minister spoke in the press conference, the Indian Prime Minister, he's talking about the year of tourism. He's talking about linking the Himalayas and Mount Fuji. He's talking about semiconductors. He's talking about small and medium enterprises. He spoke about the high-speed train between Mumbai and Delhi. I think the range of investment projects that Japan has in India is truly breathtaking, and we need to really strengthen our partnership with Japan. Semiconductors is one aspect, but I think it goes way beyond that in terms of a very holistic trade, economic and investment partnership with Japan.
All right, Ambassador Mohan Kumar and Dr. Nagar, both of you, many thanks for joining us here on this discussion.